The Russo-Ukraine war continues to be a source of surprises. The innovation that the conflict has driven is the subject of scrutiny with militaries and analysts around the world, and often cited as demonstrating many of the elements that we can expect to become standard in 21st century warfare. But a recent and surprising development has very much shown that the old principles of maneuver warfare and deception are still critical elements in military doctrine and planning. I am talking about the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. Early on the 6th of August, Ukrainian forces launched an attack across the border into the Kursk Oblast region of Russia. This is not the first time that Ukraine has conducted these sort of cross-border operations, and previous such attacks have been comparatively small spoiler operations, generally employing Russian volunteer units serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. These attacks have been essentially symbolic and for propaganda value, and the initial opinions of outside observers were that this was likely the same, and a way to divert attention from Ukraine's problems in the Donbass region, where they have been slowly losing ground recently. But that appears to have been incorrect, and now it is apparent that the Ukrainians have crossed over in considerable strength and with a huge amount of preparation. Details are sparse, but it does appear that at least two brigades, the 82nd Air Assault and the 22nd Mechanized, are being used in this offensive, and there are unsubstantiated reports that more brigades are being deployed as follow-on forces, possibly the 88th and 116th Mechanized and the 80th Air Assault Brigade. The Ukrainians have swept aside the initial defensive lines, which were composed of Russian army conscript units, FSB border security, and reportedly Chechen units, and have penetrated, as of the time of this video releasing, possibly up to as far as 30 kilometers into Russia itself. As said, the situation is very confused and official information is essentially non-existent. But the Ukrainians do appear to have taken the town of Sudza, and there are reports on Russian social media of fighting in Snagost, Korenivo, Malaya Nokia, and that Ukrainian armoured forces are pushing towards Bolsho-Sadatsko. In fact, this assault might well be the most successful in terms of territory taken of the war since the initial Russian invasion and subsequent Ukrainian counteroffensives in 2022. The Ukrainian units are some of those that have been re-equipped with Western equipment, and in contrast to the attacks launched on Russian defensive positions in the summer offensive of 2023, and which achieved comparatively little, this attack is able to utilize tanks and mechanized infantry in a much more fluid, mobile offensive action for which they are designed. And yes, the fact that this is occurring in Kursk, where in 1943 the largest tank battle in history was fought, is not lost on me. It is baffling that the Russians, whose defensives were swept over with comparatively little resistance, seem to have both ignored the possibility of such a move by the Ukrainians and then failed to observe what must have been a large build-up of forces. It should also be noted that this attack also seems to have been very well planned, and heavy use of electronic jamming and the deployment of mobile air defences by the UAF is being reported. In short, it looks like the Russians have severely dropped the ball on this one, and it is costing them in lost men, equipment and territory. In addition, the nature of communications in this region means that it may take some time for the Russians to mobilise enough resources to actually halt the Ukrainians, let alone drive them back. But there are still many questions remaining, principally about the Ukrainians' end goals with this move and whether the operation is a sensible idea at all. As said, the Ukrainians are taking a pounding in the east, with their units being slowly driven back in the Donbass region. Yes, Russian progress is a crawl, but it is progress, and many Ukrainian units in this part of the theatre are reported to be in very bad shape. The sending of so many quality units into the Kursk offensive has led to speculation on whether this move, diverting troops into a new area of operations, is the best use of resources that could instead have shored up the Eastern Front. Indeed, with the UAF openly suffering a severe shortage in manpower, it is generally wondered whether the new offensive might endanger the entire Ukrainian war effort should the eastern defences collapse. Of course, this is currently imponderable, and the Ukrainians are keeping all information on this operation under a tight lid, including stopping Ukrainian news from sending reporters to cover the Kursk offensive. To be honest, completely understandable, but still an unusual move from a military that has fully utilised media of all sorts in this conflict. Tactically and operationally, the attack has started well, and with the comparative swift advance of the Ukrainian armoured forces, the end goal is not really obvious. It could be that they will keep going until they are stopped. But the thorough preparation of this attack does suggest a definite objective, with speculation being that it is aimed at cutting communications between Kursk and Belgorod, which would have a massive impact on the logistics of the Russian military in North Ukraine. It has also been speculated that this might be a spoiling attack writ large, and now the Russians will have to strengthen their defences all across their frontier area because Ukrainians are liable to pull this sort of move again on other weak points. This would have a huge impact on available Russian strength, with it being necessary to deploy armour, anti-tank weapons and surveillance equipment to static defences across a huge zone. All equipment and personnel that are critically needed by the Russian army in Ukraine. Strategically, it is even more difficult to understand the Ukrainians' intentions, though we can once again speculate. Firstly, now the Ukrainians have Russian territory to barter with. Putin has been making noises about seeking a ceasefire with the forces staying in their current positions. This has been totally unacceptable to the Ukrainians, who argue that all this does is give the Russians breathing space to revitalise and resupply their military before commencing fresh offensives. However, if they hold Russian territory, that gives them more negotiating leverage. This is particularly important should Donald Trump win the US presidential election in November. Trump has made a lot of noise about how he would force a conclusion to the conflict, and it seems entirely likely that the Ukrainians would want to be holding Russian territory as an asset for such a situation. Another factor is the implications that this invasion has on Putin's reputation. Putin is a strongman, and the thing about strongmen is that they are only secure while their people think that about them. Putin's miscalculations throughout this conflict have been disastrous for Russia and now have led to an actual invasion of the country itself. This may indeed galvanise the Russian public further in support of the Ukraine war. But in combination with all the other failings Putin has demonstrated in the last 2 years, there are likely more and more people questioning his suitability as leader. After all, the whole point of the special military operation was to ensure Russia's security, not see parts of it under foreign occupation. There is, of course, another factor that may have driven the Ukrainians to launch the offensive: desperation. As I said, the situation for the UAF has been a steady deterioration as their eastern forces have been ground away by Russian infantry attacks. Yes, the Russian losses have been horrendous, but they can 1. Afford them, 2. Don't really give a damn about their soldiers. In other words, the war has been slowly turning against the Ukrainians. Very slowly, admittedly, but leaving things as they are probably spells doom for the Ukrainian ability to fight. So what do you do if you are losing? You change the game. The Ukrainians' Western-supplied tanks and armoured vehicles are expressly designed and built to excel in mobile warfare, so the Ukrainians have opted to use them for such. And at the moment at least, the results are plain to see, with Russian units being cut off and overrun, and the Russian military scrambling to get fresh material into the fight. And this all leaves the million-dollar question. If the Ukrainians intend to continue pushing and hold the ground they take within Russia itself, do they have the strength to do so? The Ukrainians certainly seem, at the moment at least, to have a tactical advantage in mobile warfare in terms of the quality of the equipment they are fielding as Western supplies come further into play, albeit slowly. However, the Russians still have a manpower advantage, and as the old adage goes, quantity is a quality all of its own. So, conclusions are definitely hard to draw, but I am willing to make one prediction about the Battle of Kursk 2.0. One way or another, this is going to be a critical point in the outcome of this war. Now we just have to see for which side.